History as it happens, April 15th, 2021. D.C. statehood.
We know that the only way to achieve full equality as American taxpayers is through statehood.
The U.S. House is expected to pass H.R. 51, a bill making the District of Columbia the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth. If the D.C. statehood movement ever succeeds, the capital city would become the first new state since 1959, ending a unique, often strained and dysfunctional relationship with the federal government. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Does Congress have the power to transform our nation's capital into our nation's 51st state by simple legislation? For historical, practical, and most importantly, constitutional reasons, the answer is resoundingly no.
All right, let's start with full disclosure. I live in D.C., the Columbia Heights neighborhood, actually. And on this episode, I'll be interviewing my congresswoman. But I take no position on whether my city should become a state. I'm not an advocate, I'm a journalist. I will say that statehood still appears to be a long shot, at least to my eyes, but I'm no forecaster either. If you're listening to this in some faraway place and know Washington only for its federal buildings, museums, and National Mall, the White House or Supreme Court, or for its terrible reputation burnished a quarter century ago as the murder capital of the country, as it was known then, let's forget all that. More than 700,000 tax-paying Americans call D.C. their home. The city's undergone a population boom and renaissance in recent years. We're talking about all those neighborhoods, like mine, in the 68 square miles surrounding the important stuff. That's not to say D.C. still doesn't have its share of problems. All cities do. But as Mayor Muriel Bowser put it at a recent congressional hearing, the status quo is not acceptable. It's not fair. It's undemocratic.
We are here to demand that the 220-year history of us not being represented in the capital of our country be corrected. And this Congress has within its full authority to do that.
Should every city have 2 U.S. senators? Would Washington consider
every American congressman
rejoining
who pays taxes
Maryland as
deserves
a state,
representation?
And then you would have 2 U.S. senators?
Our congresswoman should have a vote, and we should have 2 senators.
You heard the mayor there refer to Congress's authority to fix things. Well, that's in dispute. So next week, the week of April 19th, the full House is expected to vote on H.R. 51, and the Democratic majority is expected to carry the day, unlike in 1993, when majority Democrats joined almost all Republicans to defeat a statehood bill. And then this new bill will be on to the Senate, where a Republican filibuster would almost certainly await if it comes to that. Right now, the bill has only 42 Senate co-sponsors. But in any event, statehood opponents say Congress has no authority under the Constitution to turn the district into a state. They say it has to be done by amendment, and constitutional amendments require the ratification of 38 of the 50 states. At that same hearing, the Heritage Foundation's Zach Smith explained this position.
Now, advocates for H.R. 51 certainly recognize that the existence of the 23rd Amendment poses a constitutional problem for them. Unfortunately, H.R. 51 seeks to deal with this problem in a wholly inadequate and itself unconstitutional manner. It seeks to nullify the clear commands of the 23rd Amendment that the district constituting the seat of government shall appoint electors for president and vice president, and it proposes to nullify this by simple legislation.
And he added this remark about whether city dwellers, such as myself, already have influence over the Congress that governs them.
For the members here today, how many of you saw D.C. statehood yard signs or bumper stickers or banners on your way to this hearing today? I certainly did. Where else in the nation could such simple actions reach so many members of Congress?
Well, legal and bumper sticker debates aside, there's another more immediate reason why Democrats support and Republicans oppose statehood. It would send 2 senators, in all likelihood Democratic senators, to Capitol Hill. In a moment, we'll hear from the sponsor of the House bill, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was reelected in November to her 16th term.
Well, it does mean something to me personally, and not only because I represent the residents of the District of Columbia. My great-grandfather was a runaway slave from Virginia. And that means that everyone in the Holmes family, the Holmes side, has never had the same rights.
But right now, let's dig into the roots of the statehood movement. In 1969, black activists formed a D.C. Statehood Committee. It was the first modern group committed to the cause, according to journalist Sam Smith. 2 years later, a statehood party, capital S, capital P, was formed, and its nominee for D.C.'s first delegate to the House lost to Democrat Walter Fauntroy. Fauntroy would back statehood legislation in the mid-1980s, but his initial focus was on achieving home rule, so the city could have some control over its own affairs. Here's historian Stephen Diner.
I moved to Washington in 1970. The city was 71% black population. You know, at the time when I lived in D.C., the issue of statehood was intimately tied to civil rights and black political power.
And one of the first major steps forward came under Lyndon Johnson.
1967, Lyndon Johnson created a mayor commissioner to be the chief executive of the city, and also created a 9-member city council. The first mayor commissioner was Walter Washington. There's no question, Lyndon Johnson's creating this was intended as a first step toward allowing the district to elect its own local government.
And then in 1968,
a small breakthrough was considered a big deal at the time. Congress passed legislation allowing the election of the Board of Education.
And why was that a big deal?
This is the first set of positions residents of D.C. could vote for.
In 1973, Congress passed the Home Rule Act, giving D.C. residents the right to elect their own mayor and city council. And they could pass local laws and a budget, to a point.
But the budget had to be approved by the Congress and by the president.
And that remains the case today. The current D.C. delegate to the House of Representatives was first elected in 1990. In the 1960s, she was a civil rights activist, working as an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. President Jimmy Carter appointed her the first female chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and now in her 16th term in the House, she continues to advocate for the rights of district residents. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, welcome.
Glad to be with you.
So you were there in the early 1990s. It was actually November of 1993 when the House voted on the new Columbia Admissions Act. There were 258 Democrats in the House. Your party had the majority, but 105 of those Democrats joined 172 Republicans to defeat that statehood bill. What has changed in your party over the past 30 years?
30 years ago, we controlled the House in no small part because of Southern Democrats. They were good Democrats, but when it came to a matter that they had never considered before, that's what DC statehood was. That was a step too far for them. Now, Southern Democrats are Republicans. So the DC statehood bill, with the composition of the parties we have in 2021, stands an excellent chance of passage in the House of Representatives and increasingly so in the Senate.
So it sounds like your fellow Democrats don't need a lot of coaxing when it comes to this.
Democrats don't need a lot of coaxing. The Democratic Party that exists today is full-fledged for equality for all Americans, including the residents of the District of Columbia.
So what arguments are you prepared to make in favor of statehood? Because, look, we know why Democrats say they're for it, and they may make very good constitutional and other arguments in favor. But, of course, Democrats would like to get 2 more senators, right? And Republicans oppose statehood for the opposite reason. For people who are listening to this outside of D.C., what are the arguments you would use to try to get them to see it your way?
The most telling argument, the argument I think that has gotten us to 54% of the American people supporting D.C. statehood, is that the residents of their nation's capital pay the highest federal taxes per capita in the United States. When they think of why our country was formed in the first place, they think of taxation without representation. And the only part of the United States left with taxation without representation is their own nation's capital. So we find that when we talk about taxation without representation, we even get, I think it's 42% of the Republicans for statehood. But perhaps what's more important is we get both men and women. We get college and non-college educated people. We get younger and older voters, and we get Black and white voters. So we are finding more and more Americans coming to understand that the people who live in their nation's capital should be treated equally with themselves. They are learning things from these hearings. They are learning, for example, that our budget in the district is higher than that of 12 states, that we have a larger population than 2 of the states who already have full equality with other states. We have a higher bond rating than 35 states. It's pretty hard to make an argument against statehood when you see the way in which the district has surpassed in ways that count many other states.
You mentioned the public opinion polls, whether they're for statehood or not. I think a lot of Americans are surprised to learn how the district is treated. For instance, from the protests last summer, the city was not able to call up its own National Guardsmen, which was an issue in last June.
That's right. There are some ways in which the district cannot do what every other state can do, and we saw that to the detriment of the country when it couldn't call up its National Guard. Now, that's an example of something I expect to get through in a bill. You don't need statehood for that. Basic reason you need statehood is to get 2 senators so that every time a bill is passed in the House, and in the last Congress, I was voted the member that got more bills passed in the House than any other Democrat. But I have to also go to the Senate and find allies. Fortunately, I have been able to find allies and get bills passed through the Senate.
Do you believe the modern statehood movement has its origins in the civil rights movement and some moves that were made by Lyndon Johnson that started to give the city a degree of autonomy, having its own mayor and city council, etc.?
Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights movement deserve great credit for helping to move equality for the district. Remember, we have home rule, and we didn't have that until 1973. For moving home rule and right to govern itself to the district. The district doesn't have full governing rights and won't have it until statehood. But the civil rights movement did have a lot to do with that, although I should make clear that for most of its 220 years, the District of Columbia has been a majority white city. It became majority Black in the 1970s. And I'm predicting now that it's going to be majority white when the results of the most recent census are published. So color apparently didn't have much to do with it. There was this notion that the people who live in the nation's capital simply weren't entitled to equal rights with the rest of the country. It's important to note that the district was formed out of basically the state of Maryland. And when it became clear that the state that had given land that created the District of Columbia, that those people had lost their rights, they went out right then to protest. So we're not the first to protest. When the district became the district and people who lived in the land lost their rights, they began the protest movement, which has come to fruition today in 2021.
How would you respond if someone said, listen, the Constitution says the district is supposed to be the district and not a state?
I get around it very easily. It doesn't say and not a state. The framers were in doubt about just what to do about their nation's capital. It had been attacked, how to defend it. So they left most of it open. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the district cannot become a state. So because they couldn't decide just what to do with it, they made it a district under the jurisdiction of the Congress. Nothing in the Constitution said they cannot at some point become a state like other states in the Union.
For anyone who would say to you, Congresswoman, I agree with you, they would say, okay, I'm sympathetic to your argument, but it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate, so why bother? How do you respond?
The Senate is changing. It's now controlled by Democrats. Barely, but it's controlled by Democrats. And it's on its way to getting rid of the filibuster. That's why it was so late in organizing. If the filibuster goes, it'll go for everything, but it'll also go for D.C. statehood.
I'm sure you're aware that Senator Manchin from West Virginia has stated that he wants to keep the filibuster. So do you think his mind can be changed on that?
Well, yes, because he has said he wanted to keep the filibuster, but then he said he wants a talking filibuster. And that's the way the filibuster used to be. You had to stand up there and simply talk your way through why you didn't want a piece of legislation to pass. So I haven't even given up on him.
Have you spoken to him?
No.
For you personally, what does this represent?
Well, it does mean something to me personally, and not only because I represent the residents of the District of Columbia. My great-grandfather was a runaway slave from Virginia. And that means that everyone in the Holmes family, the Holmes side, has never had the same rights as other Americans. So this is in my lineage. This is in my background. This isn't just because I represent the residents of the District of Columbia, although that is foremost.
Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, we thank you for your time today. There are so many issues to consider here. Constitutional ones, the basic issue of fairness in a democracy, as well as practical issues. For instance, the D.C. court system is the federal court system. So if the city were to become a state, those federal courts would have to become state courts. And as I discussed with the Congresswoman, D.C. had no control over its National Guard last summer, when the Trump administration activated the Guard to quell Black Lives Matter protests near the White House. As Delegate Norton mentioned, there might be a way to remedy that tension over the National Guard without statehood. She has some legislation in mind. But it's not clear what could be done about the way the Trump administration flooded D.C. streets with federal law enforcement officers from any number of agencies, despite objections from Mayor Bowser. It was hard to know who the officers were last summer because some didn't wear identifying insignia. And there are other issues to consider here, too. Even if you grant Congress's authority to vote in a state, should it do so if all the elected officials of one political party object? Well, maybe D.C. residents don't care so much if no Republicans back statehood, but resentments could linger for quite a while. Of course, this wouldn't be the first time a state would be admitted under contentious circumstances. There was the Missouri Compromise, followed by Kansas-Nebraska, then the Compromise of 1850. All dealt with the highly volatile issue of whether territory should be added as free or slave states. Well, maybe those cases don't seem relevant to you, but the issue is still fresh, and that is, Americans have always disagreed, sometimes violently, over the meaning of freedom and democracy. Representation for whom? On the next episode of History as It Happens, President Biden announced the U.S. will withdraw its last troops from Afghanistan by September 11th.
It is a retreat in the face of an enemy that has not yet been vanquished, an abdication of American leadership.
Does this mean the Taliban will win the war, defeating the most powerful nation on earth? What is there to win at this point? The Taliban, next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.